So welcome to the concluding session of IPPN 2021. There was some technical issue on the break here, but yeah, I am back and we have with us Professor Bhaskar Chakravarti for the concluding address. Professor Chakravarti is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the founding executive director of the Fletcher's Institute for Business in Global Context. In addition, Bhaskar also serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, is an advisory board member for UNDP's International Center for the Private Sector in Development, based in Istanbul, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in India, and the senior advisor for digital inclusion at MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Welcome, Professor Chakravarti, to IPPN 2021, and we look forward to your keynote address.
Well, thank you, Arushi, thank you, Ashwini, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. This is, of course, an enormously important set of issues that we have covered over the course of the last 2 days, and it's a real privilege to be able to join you, sadly at the tail end, and I look forward to seeing the conference reports and the debriefs that everybody has been able to capture over the course of the last couple of days. So my objective here is to spend a bit of time reflecting on not necessarily the last couple of days, but over the last 12 months, which I'm sure have been 12 months that felt like 12 years. And this is a year that we shall not forget for a while. For any number of reasons, and each one of us has our personal experiences to relate to as far as how we survived the pandemic and the extent to which perhaps some aspects of our lives or the aspects of lives of those around us did not quite survive. And if there was any survival, the tether that held us together in many ways was the tether of digital technology. So I wanted to spend a bit of time today to reflect on how technology served us and perhaps where it served us well and where it didn't. So I am sharing my screen. Hopefully this is visible to everybody. And let me use some of my visual props, as it were, to collectively reflect on how these last 12 months of living, loving, and dying on the internet have gone. And I will provide what is a bit of a sweeping arc across the world, in some cases, swooping down into India, but by no means do I presume that this is reflective of your experience. This is largely based on very broad patterns that we've been picking up, and hopefully some of these patterns relate to your experience, and I'm sure there are several others that would be dissonant from your experience. And I would love to hear from you on how technology has served you and not, and what you've discovered about your relationship with technology over the course of this past year. So over the course of this past year, we spent a lot of our times, those of us who had the luxury of being able to flip open a screen and continue living, we quite often spent days, hours living like this. And in the first 8 weeks of the pandemic, we advanced our relationship with digital technology by 5 years. It's just been over a year since the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency. And even as the coronavirus ripped around the world economy went into reverse. And the Indian economy in particular went into an accelerated reverse. However, no matter where you were in the world, whether you were in the global north, the global south, anywhere in between, the digital economies of where you were went into fast forward mode. And this is the phenomenon that I am very keen on trying to put a finger on and trying to understand how those patterns varied in our different experiences. So we lived We lived our life on the screen. And in India, school children across the country were in lockdown, and they were attending school, pretty much like this young girl, getting her lessons, perhaps over WhatsApp or some other, messaging or media platform. Many of those habits that were developed over the course of this past year, some of which may go away once we start crawling our way back to normal. But some of these habits, may actually stick around. And this is the interesting dynamic that we might all want to, try and get a handle on. For instance, about 70% of respondents to a survey from Pratham across the country said that they found that they got help from the community in educating their children at home. And this, to my mind, I'm not looking for silver linings in what has been a rather dark cloud, but I do think that there are some behavior changes that we experienced over the course of these last 12 months that might be useful reflecting on and wondering whether some of these may be institutionalized as we come out of the tunnel on the other side. So if our children were now being educated not just by the school, by the teachers, but also by the community that surrounds them, and that could include parents, siblings, neighbors, people who are kind of part of your kind of larger extended ecosystem. And of course, some families have better, more robust ecosystems than others. And for better or for worse, children across the country had access to, those who had the luxury of having access to a smartphone, great. Those who have access to a computer, even better. And then many children had access to just a simple phone. And some of them had to combine that with broadcast messaging and even trucks with loudspeakers, going from village to village, delivering lessons. So technology was a part of a larger ecosystem that came together for many children, and not perfectly, but it did cause a shift in the way we thought about education over the course of the last 12 months, which is, it is not the responsibility of the teacher alone, and everybody jumps in. Siblings jump in, parents jump in, neighbors jump in to educate our children. And hopefully some of those behaviors will stick around even when we hope that children will go back to school and go back to doing things the way they used to. With a lockdown, you don't get to meet people. You don't get to find people to spend time with or fall in love with. And it turns out that dating apps did pretty well over the course of the last 12 months. During lockdown, during a period of quarantine, during a time when people sadly left us, many of them, millions around the world, left us because they succumbed to COVID-19. And sadly, we could not say goodbye to them face to face. And we sadly, in many cases, had to let them go on their own. And the few, and I'll use with all respect, air quotes here, the few fortunate ones who had the opportunity to say goodbye on screen. And there are several, and I know several, who had to do that. So we lived, we loved, we died, we said goodbye. We had weddings. My son got married on Zoom. We celebrated birthdays. We had happy hours. We had family gatherings. And of course, we had classes at the Indian School of Business and schools across the country, universities across the country on these digital systems. In the meantime, our physical infrastructure remained unspoilt, untouched, and strangely people-free and pollution-free for large periods of the time. So what did we learn about our relationship with technology, and how well did technology hold us together? Now, I consider myself a bit of, the equivalent of a medieval map maker who's trying to understand the outlines of an emerging, the emerging contours of the digital landmasses on the so-called digital planet. And we're still trying to figure out what these contours are. We're still trying to figure out where the bodies of water are. We're still trying to figure out whether these land masses are entirely trustworthy, or you set foot on them and they could sink. You were trying to figure out where the dragons are. So this is an interesting time for those of us who are digital map makers. I run a research initiative at the Fletcher School called the Digital Planet. And over the course of this past year, I started an initiative called Imagining a Digital Economy for All, which collapses to a handy acronym of IDEA 2030. And we're trying to understand if technology is acting as a multiplier or a divider. And of course, we know it's doing both. And how do we move the needle in the direction of multiplication and inclusion and productivity and enhancing the state of the human condition rather than dividing us? We have been collecting an enormous amount of data. This past 12 months has been like a gigantic science experiment in terms of us trying to understand how we behave on the internet and how we relate to technology. Here is from India, the top 10 websites that we visited in India. And not surprisingly, you have Google, YouTube, also part of Google, Facebook, Instagram, right at the top. Of course, right after that is an adult website. And we can keep going. I can keep running down the list of all the different sites that we've been spending time on over the course of the last 12 months, which is a mix between productivity, work, connecting with others, entertainment, well-being, and just whiling away the time. Here's another list of mobile apps that we've been using in India. And of course, not surprisingly, you have the WhatsApps, the YouTubes, the Facebooks right at the top. And then there are a lot of messaging and connecting platforms. So the fundamental human desire to connect, the fundamental human desire to be in the company of others. And of course, there is probably no country in the world like India where we are always in human company. And the fact that we were separated from each other was an unusual phenomenon, an unusual way to try and figure out how did technology act as a substitute for all of that. Now, one of the questions that I raised when we were studying all this data was how did the presence of technology in our lives make a difference to how much of a buffer we had to our economic circumstances. So the theory being, if you are highly digitally evolved as a country, then you might be somewhat more resilient to the economic shock of COVID. And we went in to the data and tried to understand how true that was. And it turns out that the broad conclusion we reached was that technology did play a role in providing a measure of economic resilience around the world. About 20% of economic resilience could be traceable back to digital advancement and digital evolution. And here is a graph that might kind of put a bit of a finer point to that. So what I've got on what looks like a complicated page is imagine what we are looking at as two different axes. So we've been tracking 90 countries around the world, over 350 different indicators. The last 12 years, we're trying to understand how countries are moving from a physical past to a digital future and how they're performing on those digital platforms, how demand is progressing, what's the state of supply and infrastructure, what's the state of laws and regulations, what's the state of competition, what's the state of regulations regarding data use and privacy, and the role of governments and the role of venture capital and entrepreneurship and investment in tech companies, all the different factors that play into the digital ecosystem. We're doing that across 90 countries. So here I have most of the 90, I think it's like 80 or so that I've got on this map to keep it a little bit readable. And on the horizontal axis, as I go from left to right, I've got countries arrayed in terms of their state of digital evolution. The further to the right you are, the more digitally evolved is a country, okay? And the further to the left, the less digitally evolved. So you can see countries like Singapore and Taiwan and or Norway, Finland are to the extreme right, and countries to the left, are Colombia, Morocco, the Philippines, Rwanda, and actually India, on the left-hand side of this map. And then as you go from south to north, is a measure of economic resilience. So the further to the top of the graph you are, the more resilient you were during the first phase of the lockdown last year. And what this graph is showing is an interesting phenomenon, which is that there is some connection between digital evolution, that horizontal measure, and economic resilience, that vertical measure. But it is not universally true. It's not universally true. And one of the factors that is the connection between technology, evolution, and resilience is actually the degree to which people maintain quarantine and maintain social distancing. So the darker the image that I've got here, these are the countries that actually maintained a high degree of social distancing, and in the first phase of the lockdown. And you can see that the darker circles are generally in the southern part of this graph. In other words, they ended up not being terribly economically resilient, and their economies took a pretty significant hit over the course of the pandemic. And here's where India is. So the economy took a big hit, and its digital evolution is uneven and pretty much at the bottom end of the graph that we've got here. Now, the connection between digital evolution and economic resilience, as I mentioned, is not felt universally, not felt uniformly across the world. And let me give you sort of three different examples. One is the United Kingdom, which is the bottom right of this graph. United Kingdom is a highly digitally evolved society. However, it took a big hit in terms of its economy in the first phase of the lockdown. And natural question is why? Very different from another country close to the United Kingdom, which is Ireland, which is right up there on the top right of the graph. Highly digitally evolved, in fact, almost as digitally evolved as the United Kingdom, but it showed an enormous amount of resilience during lockdown. And then I just picked a third country, which is in a very different part of the world and had a somewhat different experience, highly digitally evolved, and also highly resilient, and that was South Korea. So the United Kingdom was an outlier, partly because a large part of its economy is dependent on travel and tourism and services. And in fact, 13% of its economy is dependent on face-to-face services. So when you go into lockdown, that takes a massive swipe out of massive cut out of the UK economy, despite the fact that it is technologically evolved. Ireland, on the other hand, a large part of its economy happens on digital platforms. So even though Ireland actually maintained a high degree of social distancing during the lockdown, it managed to keep its economy running. In fact, among the EU countries, it is one of the most digitally reliant economy in that cluster. And South Korea is an interesting country which used its digital technology to generate data on its citizens and then use that data to track COVID exposure and track people's movements in an extremely intrusive but effective way. So you ended up with South Koreans pretty much managing to go about their day-to-day lives, of course, not the way they did before pandemic, but about as close as one could imagine, and they kept their economy running. And the use of technology was a powerful way in which they managed to make that happen. Now, that experience can't be replicated or anywhere else in the world. It's that kind of data intrusion is hard to do in most liberal democratic societies. Another country that followed a similar pattern was Taiwan. Now, if I were to take a step back and try and understand where India and all these 90 countries sit in that larger journey of going from a physical past to a digital future, and situate this COVID experience in that larger journey, let me give you a picture of the state of digital evolution across the world and where India is situated in that journey. So I'm going to show you another complicated graph. And here, the vertical axis is digital evolution. So the absolute state of evolution, the absolute state of where the country is in its journey from a physical past to a digital future. And the horizontal axis is the momentum, the speed of change. How quickly is that country changing? And on the top right-hand part of the graph are the countries that I would call the standout countries. These are strong, both in terms of evolution and strong in terms of momentum. And these are countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, and of course, South Korea and the UAE and Malaysia and the United States and Taiwan, so on and so forth. And then there are countries on the top left of this map, which are the ones that I would call the digitally mature countries. And along with maturity, they've also developed digital arthritis. So they're sort of slowed down. And these are the stall out countries, mostly located in Western Europe. And then there are the countries that I would consider to be some of the most exciting in the world. These are the countries that haven't yet achieved their full potential in terms of digital evolution. But they are in a breakout mode. They are exhibiting very high momentum. At the far extreme is China, and then you have Azerbaijan, Indonesia, and India. In terms of momentum, India is number 4 in our overall analysis. And then you have the countries that are struggling to hit their potential or to hit their stride on both fronts, on digital evolution and momentum. And so there are a number of countries here that one might recognize: Hungary, Pakistan, Sri Lanka in our own neighborhood, and then several countries in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, and so on. And that's where India is situated. And I can give you an even more detailed breakdown in terms of how India ranked on a variety of different factors. On supply side, it showed an enormous breakthrough over the last several years in terms of improving the supply side of its digital ecosystem. On the demand side, it actually dropped. It had tremendous improvements in terms of institutional change and innovation. And it was a significant period of growth for the Indian digital ecosystem. And whatever buffering we saw that the Indian economy took a very, very big hit, not just at the macro level, but at the individual level. And the individual stories are horrendous, and they're horrifying for millions, hundreds of millions of those who were locked down and locked out, and then set off on their roads back to their homes in towns and villages far away from where they lived. And so for them, the phone that they were carrying was probably the only connection, not necessarily to a source of livelihood, but to their lives, to connect with the relatives that they were hoping to meet with when they got back home, or to their place of work with a promise that they will return. I'll show you one more graph because there is just so much data that we collect in this medieval map-making process. But I thought I could not stop sharing without a very interesting piece of analysis that we did with our data analytics partners, Equiception, on the state of people's emotions and sentiments and how they were feeling during lockdown. So let me interpret what this graph is showing. What this graph has done is we picked up all the posts on all the major messaging platforms, from WhatsApp to Twitter to a variety of other digital platforms, Facebook and so on and so forth. And we ran a sentiment analysis of how citizens in India were feeling during lockdown and how they were feeling about life during COVID. And the period that I've captured here is from January to July of 2020. And the graph, to interpret this, one has to see that these curves, they represent different emotions. And the predominant emotion so the different emotions are: the green is surprise, black is sadness, the yellow is happiness, orange is fear, the purple is disgust, and the red is anger. And you can see all these emotions were playing out over social media over the course of lockdown. And as we know, India is very active on social media, perhaps one of the most hyperactive social media societies anywhere in the world. The interesting thing that we saw over the course of and the most intense period of lockdown was the predominant emotion was happiness. That's the yellow curve, riding over the others. There's a fair amount of fear and uncertainty in the early stages, and then we end up with somewhat more exhilaration. And sometimes the exhilaration is primarily people sending jokes across WhatsApp in order to keep everybody's spirits up. But another source of exhilaration came from the fact that there was a lot of social division. We did some backward analysis of what the underlying causation was and what the content of the posts were. And a large part of the exhilaration had to do with identifying the other, identifying some parts of society who were not us, and then generating high energy posts to vilify certain parts of society and elevate some others. And that led to a high energy of social media posting during the period of lockdown. Sadly, a large part of the divisiveness was coming not just from the bottom up, but from the top down, from many of our leaders at the local and at the government level, at the national level. So here we are, back to the pristine view of India Gate, which I haven't been to New Delhi in the past year. So I'm assuming that pristine view has got hazier now with traffic and people having returned. But for a brief moment, it was wonderful to be able to see India Gate and the boulevards surrounding it, the way I remember growing up in New Delhi as a child. And as we go back and revisit these boulevards around India Gate and other parts of not just New Delhi, but many wonderful cities and towns across India, it's useful to remember that the idea of embedding these gigantic boulevards and these green open spaces in the middle of our cities came out of a different pandemic. It came out of the cholera pandemic, which ironically originated in Bengal, and it made its way around the world. It made its way to Europe and eventually made its way to cities like London and Paris and several others. After the cholera epidemic ebbed, they rebuilt many of these Western cities with the idea that bad air was the cause of cholera. And we needed to let in plenty of sunlight to disperse that bad air. And in order to let in sunlight, cities like Paris were rebuilt and redesigned with wide open boulevards to let in the sunlight. Those boulevards from Paris inspired the boulevards in Delhi. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris inspired India Gate in Delhi. So we learned from a previous pandemic. And maybe it was a mistaken belief that bad air caused cholera, but at least it's left us with these beautiful boulevards that inspire us today, in front of which we take selfies. And we visit cities like New Delhi and Paris and even Cairo for their beautiful boulevards. Over the course of the last year, we have seen some aspects of the technology infrastructure that mostly held together, that kept us tethered to some form of a semblance of regular life, kept our economies running to the extent possible they could. And these are the technology boulevards that we must continue to build. And as we come out of this pandemic, we must continue to expand them and make them available for everybody. One of the beautiful things about the Access to India Gate is that it is a place for people of all socioeconomic classes, of all castes, from all parts of the country to gather and enjoy these boulevards. So we need to make those digital boulevards inclusive and accessible and affordable to everybody. And we can look back and admire the beauty of these technologies and what they can do for us. But I'll leave you with one final thought, which is that we need to build boulevards after the pandemic ends, but also we need to remember one more thing, which is the other major development that happened post-cholera, which is the development of modern sewage systems at the bottom of the big cities like Paris and London, and eventually cities like New Delhi and Mumbai. We realized that cholera, the real cause of cholera, is actually bad sanitation. It's not the bad air, it's bad sanitation. So you have to do the hard work of putting in modern sewage systems underneath these cities. And these sewage systems are difficult to construct. They're messy. Nobody will take a selfie in front of them. Nobody even bothers to think about them. That is the hard work that we need to do. So in addition to those beautiful boulevards, we need to build on top. We need to take the time, the investment, and put our energies against building the sewage systems under the ground. That means changing the underlying structural systems that hold us together. And the underlying structural systems are the digital infrastructure and all other kinds of infrastructure, and making sure that they are free of divisive rhetoric, that they provide a degree of privacy, a degree of ownership, and a degree of empowerment to all our users. And ensuring that is a lot of hard work. It's much easier to put up a nice website. It's much easier to design an app and put it on the screen of somebody's smartphone. Much harder to build these sewage systems that require coming up with democratic rules and laws and that protect user privacy and provide a digital economy for all. And I leave all of you who have attended this conference to think about the boulevards and sewers, particularly in the digital domain, that you will be a part of as you start walking towards that light at the end of the COVID tunnel and help build a better world from the world that we had when we entered the tunnel in the first place. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to any comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakravarti. Such an informative and interesting discussion. A perfect concluding keynote to say. You spoke about the analysis, the sentiment analysis, the digital advancement and economic resilience, the analysis regarding digital evolution and digital trust, and it was truly insightful. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time here. So now we come towards the end of the IPPN conference, and we have with us Professor Ashwini Chhatre, requesting Professor Chhatre to please deliver the vote of thanks and also to sum up the two-day deliberations. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Arushi. It is a delight and an honor and an impossible task. Nobody can sum up these fantastic, rich, invigorating, and deep conversations that we have had. Just today, I had the pleasure and the good fortune of moderating a session that brought together 5 papers looking at different aspects of inequality in COVID-19 pandemic and its response and management. And in my comments to authors, and at the end of that session, I expressed my realization that all of these inequalities existed before, but they were invisible. They were hard to see. They were well hidden because we had built a system where extreme poverty is pushed under the rug, and disabilities and other taboos are out of sight. And COVID-19 pandemic sort of put them in our face. There was, and of course, scholars who participated in this conference revealed these and sort of made all of us, not just the academic and research community, but also the policy making community, and with a big contribution from civil society, forced us to face these inequalities, these consequences that already always existed but were invisible. So the pandemic made things visible that cannot be you cannot unsee them anymore. They are there. The migrants crisis is there, and it's left scars that are going to be difficult to heal, which is a good thing because we will not forget in a hurry. The role that technology has played, the number of papers that outlined the multiple different ways in which technology came into play, and an equally important focus on a number of other papers that highlighted how technology failed to play an important role, or at least a sufficiently important role. Ways in which technology helped make visible these inequalities, and the ways in which technology created and enhanced these inequalities, whether it was Aadhaar, whether it was access to mobile smartphones, or to digital platforms for seeking jobs. Technology was both our savior and our bane. It is something that we must take forward, and Bhaskar is absolutely right. We must look forward to what the pandemic might have left us with. What digital boulevards are we building, even as we talk about the older ones? As inequalities become visible, and our realization that they already always existed, what policy options do we have? From all our conversations, several ideas have come forward. And I don't have answers, and I certainly am not going to even try and sum up these conversations. I think that is a Sisyphean task or a fool's errand, and I mean it with utmost seriousness. What I found, if I may take 2 more minutes, what I found is a very high degree of heterodoxy, that people, researchers, civil society members, academics, policymakers, practitioners, came at the same problem from multiple directions. And this was, for example, illustrated through a fantastic series of roundtables organized by Professor Satyajit Singh from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He brought together practitioners, district magistrates, former secretaries, with policymakers, with NGO, civil society representatives, for conversation around what do we want. Can we at least get clarity before we start about how to influence policy. What do we and how do we find it? How can we build a bottom-up knowledge? Forms be not through several panels. And we are back, and I hope I am indeed back and not just speaking to myself. And this is something that I have realized. The most common sentence, the two most common sentences that I have heard in the last now 1 year and 3 months, the first one is, am I audible? And the second one is, you are on mute. And of course, the third one is what I speak to myself is that here we go again, and we have lost the connection. We are getting used to it. We are getting more patient with technology. That often works, but sometimes doesn't. We are certainly getting used to overcoming those in ways, and there is a learning curve there. How do we get better in the use of technology for connecting, for collaborating, and so on? The technology that was always available, but we were not forced to use it. And the spirit of collaboration through technology, through mechanics that were always available, but we chose not to use it, or at least not as deeply and as intensely. That spirit permeated throughout this conference. And we had very large number of attendees throughout the sessions, throughout the 2 days, across all sessions. And the fact that we could pull off a virtual conference, completely virtual, with participation in the same session from people on the west coast of California and in Singapore, provides us with the inspiration to continue this conversation, continue this dialogue, continue this continue this investment in this dynamic and rapidly evolving field of public policy, where the spirit of collaboration must reach out from just talking about policy to actually co-creating knowledge that informs policy on a continuous basis. I think we have started, we certainly accelerated. This conference, I'm confident, played an important role in that acceleration. And I sincerely hope that we can build on that momentum until we meet again next year. And that the India Public Policy Network continues to value the heterodoxy, the spirit of collaboration, the integration of research and praxis as we move forward towards the light at the end of the tunnel, as Bhaskar so eloquently put it. So I want to end with the word of thanks. All of us know there is a significant number of people who have worked day and night, not just over the last 1 week and not just over the last 2 days, to make this possible. There are people with inputs into the technology. There are, of course, partners who put the platform together from Dreamcast. There is a team led by Dr. Arushi Jain and those behind the scenes, Sangeeta, Karishma, and there are so many names that, of course, all of you have come into contact with without ever meeting them. And a vote of thanks would not be complete without all of us acknowledging the hard work that goes on. We all know what hard work goes on in putting together a physical conference. I had not imagined that work would actually be greater in putting together a virtual conference. But I will take credit where none is deserved. And in my vote of thanks, I do want to acknowledge the labor that has gone into it. And I hope we will be able to do justice to this labor of love, the conference, and all of us will delight in its success and take home the lessons until we meet again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Chhatre, also for all your guidance through this conference, and always. That's the most important thing that we have, and that gears the team actually to do its best. Thank you so much. And thanks to my team, everyone who's there at the back end, including our reporters who have been sitting through sessions, writing, taking notes, and updating us every hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and to our audience for being a wonderful audience. Thank you.